The purpose of this video is to clarify how we can use the recipe conversion template from my website, feastonadventure.com, to convert a conventional recipe into a just add water recipe for the backcountry. Next, we're going to look at a generic recipe for a stuffed bell pepper. So what we'll see here on the left is that I've put in my conventional recipe. I've got the main ingredients there and the basic instructions, the directions for how to complete the recipe. So in converting this into a just add water meal, where we want to begin is we want to begin by identifying the main protein source. So for this recipe, we've got that 1 pound of ground beef. Now for a just add water recipe, we're generally making a single serving. And if we were to look at our freeze-dried ground beef can, what we would see is that a half cup is generally about 1 serving of ground beef per person. So that's a really good indicator of where we should start for our recipe. Next, we're going to identify the primary carbohydrates. And in this case, that's that half cup of rice. Now, in the case of the stuffed pepper, a half cup of rice is 1/2 of dry rice, and that's going to expand quite a bit when it cooks. So for the purposes of our casserole, what we're going to do is we're going to use 2/3 of a cup of instant rice. And instant rice pretty much is going to remain the same amount once it's rehydrated. Next, we want to identify the primary herbs and spices that make up the flavor components here. So in that case, coming from the main recipe, we've got 1 teaspoon of salt, 1/4 cup of ketchup, parsley to taste, and some black pepper. So what I've done here in the just add water recipe is putting in a teaspoon of sweetener, and that is basically taking the space of the ketchup in this recipe. I don't have dehydrated ketchup. I don't see any value in keeping that around. So we're going to make up that flavor profile by using some different components. And one of those is the teaspoon of sweetener that we have here. For the parsley, I'm putting in 1/2 teaspoon of freeze-dried parsley. That's a really important clarification here in that parsley is one of those ingredients that loses a lot of flavor through normal drying. So your regular dried parsley that you might find at a grocery store isn't necessarily going to have as much parsley flavor as you would get out of a freeze-dried parsley. Freeze-dried parsley is fairly easy to find. There's a brand called Lighthouse that often you'll find in the fresh produce section of your grocer. And they have little jars of freeze-dried herbs and spices, and parsley is one of those. So I would recommend that you use that here. When we get to the salt, what we generally need to know here is that usually when we're making a just add water recipe, it ends up being somewhere between 1/6 and 1/4 of a conventional recipe. Now, if we look on the left, we'll see that we're making stuffed peppers based on 4 bell peppers, which is probably a pretty good indication that this recipe is making 4 servings. And for our just add water meal, we want to end up with 1 serving. So we would want to try to have, again, 1/6 to 1/4 of the herbs and spices in our recipe. And that's why I've put 1/4 teaspoon of salt here. It is important to note that 1/4 teaspoon of salt generally seems to be the right amount of salt for any just add water meal that is a single serving. And then finally, black pepper to taste. Next, we'll identify the vegetable components. Obviously, bell peppers are going to be a really important part of this recipe. So we're using 1/4 cup of diced red pepper that's been dehydrated. The other thing that we'll notice in there is that we've got onion. So we're going to put in 1 tablespoon of onion flakes to make up that component of the flavor. The final vegetable that you see there is diced tomato, and I'm actually putting that in the sauce for this dish, specifically because I think that using tomato sauce is going to have a greater impact on this dish than using diced tomato, although there is freeze-dried tomato available, and I do use that regularly. But let's remember that we're also using 1/4 cup of ketchup in the conventional recipe. So we can achieve the flavor profile really well of both those things by putting in a tablespoon of tomato sauce that's dehydrated and pulverized tomato sauce that we're putting in this dish. And finally, what we'll notice in the recipe is a bunch of cooking instructions like brown, saute, and bake. And that's going to lead us to want to introduce some other flavor components that can help bring the flavor of this whole casserole closer to what we would find in a conventional recipe. And for that, what I've added is 1 teaspoon of bouillon into the sauce and thickener. And that's going to replace a lot of those browning flavors that we otherwise are missing because we're not doing any cooking in camp. I've added a 1/4 teaspoon of fried garlic. And this is because the recipe does call for garlic. And I've slipped it down here into the umami fried roasted baked section simply because I want to focus on the fact that I want to use fried dried garlic and not just garlic powder or normal garlic. And a really good reason for doing that is because it brings a bunch of roasted and caramel flavors into our dish. We can find fried garlic that's dried quite easily at most Asian specialty markets, as well as in ethnic aisles of our local grocery store. And finally, I'm adding 1 teaspoon of MSG, which is an optional ingredient, just knowing that that's really going to help bring out all the flavors and make this feel like a complete meal when it's all said and done. And that's how we use the recipe conversion template.